Within the Product Access Division of Uniphar Group, we solve pharmaceutical access problems each and every day, ensuring patients get the treatment they need when they need it most. Our tailored distribution service, extensive global supply network, and territory-specific regulatory expertise is unparalleled. We offer expanded access, partnering with manufacturers to ensure rapid access to new treatments, on-demand access, providing unlicensed and difficult-to-source medicines globally, and aid in development, supplying charities and NGOs with our pharmaceutical and medtech portfolios. With our integrated end-to-end solution, unmatched expertise, proven track record, and focus on high-value markets, everything we do is supported by the latest digital technology. A cutting-edge operational platform to get medicines to patients, and advanced digital platforms and educational content to connect and engage stakeholders, providing support for patients and carers. We also capture and leverage real-world and patient-reported data, providing manufacturers with invaluable insights. As a global leader with over 50 years of supply chain expertise in more than 160 countries, we are growing and expanding faster than ever. Everything we do because we care. We are committed to positive patient outcomes. Product Access, improving lives globally.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the forum, IFA's thought leadership platform for healthcare and medicines innovation. My name is Jonathan McCrae. I'm delighted to be your host for this series. The forum is a sort of a reimagining of the Innovate for Life annual conference from IFA, which explored ideas, demonstrated values, and brought new innovations to the fore. Thanks to Uniphar, who have sponsored this series. It is our fourth episode in this series, and we've had some fantastic discussions so far, and I'm really looking forward to this one. We're going to explore cell and gene therapies, which are among the most promising medicines available today. They treat and sometimes prevent or even cure diseases that previously we may not have had those sort of solutions available. Today sees the launch of the Pathfinder study by PwC, and we want to say thank you to all of the people who were involved in commissioning it, IFA, along with Pfizer, Janssen, Novartis, Bayer, Takeda, Gilead, and Astellas. we're going to be looking at the application of these therapies and the impact of their trajectory on disease. We'll be hearing from patient organizations and exploring reimbursement, access, and all those ideas. But we'll start off, I suppose, hearing from Shane Gannon, who's a director of pharmaceuticals and life consulting at PwC. He's going to be taking us through the study, and after that, we'll be joined by Professor David Keegan. He's a consultant ophthalmologist, Brian O'Mahony from the Irish Hemophilia Society, and Bernadette Carr, who's with VHI Insurance. So if you have questions, and I'm sure you will, please do them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of those as I can. But without further ado, I'll hand you over to Shane Gannon from PwC to take us through this report. Thanks, Shane.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. I'm just going to share the presentation now. So hopefully everybody can see it. So as I said, thank you very much for your time this morning. So today, given the time constraints, what I'll do is we'll probably go through some of the sort of the key points from our study, some of the highlights as and just to kind of give you a sense of what's covered in it, and also talk a bit about the sort of our recommendations. So the presentation today, I think we'll probably have it in sort of three segments. The first segment will be just on what are actually cell and gene therapies, and sort of why are they exciting. The second part, we will walk through sort of 4 concrete examples of the sort of clinical impact that these types of products can have. And then the third part, we can discuss, I can talk through some of the sort of recommendations that we have about starting a dialogue about improving access for these type of therapies to patients that are in Ireland. So first, just to start in terms of, why CGTs, what they are and why they're so exciting. And so if you look at what we have here, which is effectively sort of a timeline of sort of medical innovation, where we're moving from, which is in the past, which is really sort of a one-size-fits-all approach, so thinking sort of broad-spectrum antibiotics, moving towards a sort of precision treatment where medicines are tailored to individual patients and diseases. Cell and gene therapies we consider are really at the sort of the cutting edge of clinically proven medicines that are available for patients. And they start to give us a real insight or glimpse into what it will be like to sort of treat, prevent, potentially cure sort of many sort of genetic and some sort of acquired diseases as well. So as the name would suggest, there are both cell and gene therapies. And in the report, we spend a bit of time just explaining what those are. And if you don't mind, I can go through a bit of that just now. So for a cell therapy is effectively what they do is they aim to introduce sort of new healthy cells into a patient's body to replace sort of diseased or missing cells. And one of the examples we use in the report is a therapy called CAR-T, which is used for the treatment of different types of blood cancer. So in CAR-T, what happens is that a hospital will extract your white blood cells, your immune cells, and it will activate a particular type of cell within those called T cells. It will isolate them, and pharmaceutical companies, what they will do is they will genetically engineer these T cells to target your blood cancer, so the individual patient's blood cancer. So those engineered T cells will target your blood cancer, and then they're infused back into the patient, where they will then help activate your immune system to target those types of those blood cancers. So that's effectively cell therapy. It's using cells to either replace missing cells or to sort of target disease. Gene therapy is somewhat different in that we're not talking necessarily about cells. It's about the delivery of a functional copy of a gene to either an organ or a patient where they may have where that may not be present. So this can be done in a number of ways. One very simple way is it's sort of packaged into a delivery vehicle, such as a virus, and then it's injected sort of directly into a sort of target organ. In the example here, we have liver. I think in some of the diseases we reference in the report, the eye is another example where it can be delivered to. So that's one way. Another way is where, again, sort of cells, just stem cells can be extracted from your body can be extracted from your body and sort of re-administered to the patient after they've received the sort of the functional copy of the gene. Cell and gene therapies is one of the most active areas in terms of R&D for for those types of therapies. There are many hundreds of therapies, or many thousands of therapies targeting many hundreds of disorders. And in the report, what we've tried to do is just to give a sense of what those are and what the impact could be in Ireland. And our report is very much sort of focused on sort of late stage development, and here we're tilted towards therapies that have been approved by the European Medicines Agency. And in the report, you can see here it covers a broad set of areas, right through from sort of cancer all the way through to sort of metabolic and endocrinology. And in the report, we focus on sort of 4 of those areas, and those are sort of cancer, in particular blood cancers such as leukemia and lymphoma, hemophilia, inherited retinal diseases such as retinitis pigmentosa, and also neurology using spinal muscular atrophy as the example. So what I will do now is I can sort of talk you through 4 of those examples, where I can give you a bit of background on what these disorders are, and then also the sort of potential impact that we're seeing with these types of products and medicines. Yeah. So the first one, as I've said, is CAR T. So CAR T therapy, which we just explained there, is primarily targeted with blood cancers. So it is used to treat certain blood cancers in which patients have failed to respond to all conventional treatments. And this is typically about 10% of patients who have not responded to sort of multiple rounds of more conventional therapies. And that would include sort of your standard sort of chemotherapy. And so CAR T is a one-time administration where their cells are removed from the body, modified, and then they are put back in to attack the cancer cells. And on the right here, we see some examples of the clinical efficacy for these types of therapies. So in the middle here, what you can see is what they looked at is the overall sort of response rate. So how likely are you to respond to this type of therapy? And in a clinical trial with sort of children and young adults, what we've seen is that you're about 4 times more likely to respond to a CAR T treatment than a sort of another round of a conventional treatment, which you may have gone through several rounds of already. So your response rate for CAR T versus conventional treatment is about 80% compared to 20%. So you're more likely to respond. The second point that we're starting to see in the clinical data is that the actual longer term efficacy of these products is better than sort of a conventional treatment as well. So on the right here, what you can see is the overall survival rate after 3 years after treatment, which you should remember is a one-time treatment. So you're 2.5 times more likely to survive 3 years post-treatment with the CAR T than if you were to go through another round of the same treatment again. So again, you're more likely to respond to a CAR T treatment, and you're more likely to survive longer if you have received CAR T. Another example, which is more gene therapy focused, are inherited retinal diseases. And these are a group of rare eye diseases that are caused by gene mutations that result in a sort of progressive loss of vision that often leads to blindness. And so examples here are retinitis pigmentosa, Usher syndrome, and Stargardt disease. And historically, the patient interventions here have been about sort of helping people deal with this. So it would be sort of visual aids, therapy, counseling, and sort of alterations to a patient's living situation that allows them to deal with this sort of progressive loss of their vision. So again here, the gene therapies that are being developed for this are often one-time treatments. And on the right, I can talk a bit about what that means in terms of the treatments that are available. So here we have some data from a clinical trial that uses something called an MLMT test. And effectively what that is, it's a type of obstacle course where you have to pass it in various levels of light that goes from very bright to very dark. And what you can see here is that, in the red bar is that people who have normal vision, pass it pretty much all the time. I mean, it's an obstacle course, but it's not the crystal maze. It's not incredibly difficult. However, when you look at it with patients that are either visually impaired, you'll see that it's 0%. So in this particular study, in this particular clinical trial, no one in the control group actually fully passed the test. However, when you look at sort of patients that have received the gene therapy, it has sort of slowed down or delayed sort of disease progression. And you can see that about 65% of people or patients, the pass rate is about 65% for this test. And when you compare sort of treated versus non-treated patients, you can see that with the gene therapy, if you look at the actual score on the test, you're 9 times more likely to have a better outcome with the gene therapy than without it. So again, a lot of potential here for stopping disease progression, slowing it down, and preventing patients from going completely blind. Another example of sort of slowing or disease modifying in degeneration is with spinal muscular atrophy. So SMA, or spinal muscular atrophy, is a genetic disease that is caused by the lack of a functional gene called SMN1. And what this results in is sort of progressive and irreversible loss of motor neurons that affect sort of muscle functions, including sort of breathing, swallowing, and basic movement. There are probably 2 types, of which SMA type 1 is the predominant, which accounts for 60% of diagnosis. So if you're an infant that is diagnosed with SMA type 1, you will never achieve normal development milestones like sitting without support. And you will also, those infants will experience difficulty in breathing, swallowing, poor head control, and severe muscle weakness. And in fact, if it's left untreated, SMA type 1 leads to death or the need for permanent ventilation by the age of 2 in more than 90% of cases. And you can start to see this on the right here, which is some data from a clinical trial that discusses the impact, that shows the sort of impact of these products. So what you can see here is the sort of the bar on the bottom, which says natural history. And this would be the sort of progression of the disease that you would expect if there was no treatment. So there that you can see by about 20 months, you only have a sort of 40% chance of surviving without permanent ventilation. So already you can start to see a dramatic decrease in your chance of survival or having without ventilation. However, if you look at the sort of top line here, which talks about the treatment, which again is a gene therapy, you can see that at 20 months, in the high 90% of patients are currently alive and do not require sort of permanent ventilation. So again, you can start to see from very early age that these type of products can start to change or modify the disease progression of many of these types of very severe neurodegenerative diseases. The fourth example, which we have, is hemophilia, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, but it's an inherited blood disorder in which the blood does not clot properly. And the lack of a clotting factor causes people to bleed for longer than normal after an injury, and means that they're also at risk of increased bleeding internally. So patients with severe hemophilia may have to inject themselves several times a week with a clotting factor. And again, gene therapies here aim to be sort of a one-time treatment to sort of start to address this. And what we show on the right is, again, sort of preliminary data from an early phase 2 clinical trial that talks about the impact that these products can have. So what you see here is basically the percentage of blood clotting, the percentage level of blood clotting factor that is you would expect that we've seen in a clinical trial 48 weeks post-treatment. And that is compared to what you'd expect to see in both moderate and severe hemophilia without treatment, so without the administration of a clotting factor. So a normal level of clotting factor would be between 50 and 150%. And what you start to see in this trial is that after 48 weeks, so almost a year after treatment, the level is at about 68%. So definitely back in the sort of the normal range for what you'd expect to see from for clotting factors, and certainly very different from what you'd see if you didn't have this, which would be 5 and 1%. Again, this is a sort of one-time treatment, and this is the sort of the durability of the response after about a year. So these therapies are those are sort of 4 examples that we've taken, and they kind of start to show when we say disease modifying or disease or to slow them down or stop progression of the disease, you can start to see what that means. It means that if you're on a treatment now and receiving that several times a week or several times a year, you may not have to do that in the future. And they are somewhat controversial treatment in that the price that is associated with these products can be very high. And that has sort of led to a situation where it's quite variable in terms of where you have access and where these therapies are actually reimbursed. And so as part of the work, what we looked at is, and you can see here on this map, we looked at sort of several markets in Europe and also North America to see where at least one cell or gene therapy has been reimbursed to date. And unfortunately, what you can see is that Ireland has not reimbursed these as of the beginning of May. There have been no therapies that have been reimbursed in Ireland. So, and in fact, what you have is a situation where if you take CAR T, often patients under the treatment abroad scheme travel abroad to receive these treatments. So you can imagine what would happen is they may travel, for instance, to London or Manchester to have their white blood cells extracted, go home, then come back a couple of weeks later to actually receive the therapy. And these would be patients that were often extremely ill or maybe very young. So, they are not reimbursed here, and that does actually have sort of impact for patients. The reasons for there may be many reasons as to why these therapies are not reimbursed, but obviously one of them, as I just mentioned, may relate to cost, and it also relates to sort of that there are many challenges with assessing, how cost effective these products are, and what makes it sort of, from the sort of government perspective, what makes a good price, or what would be a good price for those. So there are a number of factors and challenges associated with the sort of standard way of assessing them, the HTA, that make it more complex than sort of another medicine to assess the value of these medicines. And some of those challenges, and again, this is a high-level summary. There's more detail in the report, but some of those challenges we've kind of identified and listed here. And they actually start with, the first one is that the actual assessment itself may be too narrow. It may focus on sort of overall measures, again, in sort of taking cancer as an example, of overall survival. It may not include sort of intermediate data points, or it may not include other data points that would show the sort of contribution that these products would have to society. So the assessment itself may be too narrow for these type of products. And in terms of building on that, what, as I've said, is these are cutting edge medicines. They are, several have just been approved or in the process of being approved, and often for sort of in sort of rare diseases where there's been no standard of care until now. So there is an urgent case for getting these medicines into the clinic. And what that means is that often there's insufficient long-term data. So for several of these products, you don't have sort of 5 or 10-year outcomes. We don't know yet in terms of how effective they are in the longer term, because again, they're so new and they're still being fully investigated. So the building on that, again, because these are several sort of rare diseases, there are sort of smaller patient populations by definition, or they're sort of a smaller subset of a larger disease. So again, because they're small patient populations, the clinical data associated with them may be underweighted in the sort of metrics that are used as part of the assessments. And finally, again, because most or many of these gene therapies target very sort of severe, often fatal disorders, it's not ethical to run a sort of your standard clinical trial which compares the treatment to placebo. So often in this situation, what you see is they use single-arm trials, their treatment compared to the past. So as you can see, there are several challenges associated with the use of how to assess the value for these, and what's a good price, and do you pay it all up front? And we feel that one of the ways that you can assess some of the challenges with that is through what it's called sort of shorthand novel contracting or novel reimbursement models. Now in the report we address several of these, and you can see a table here. I won't go through it detail by detail, but what I would say is that effectively what it comes down to is novel contracting is a mechanism that allows you to revisit the price that is paid for these products dependent on how good these products actually perform in the clinic. So it can take a number of examples. It can be that you have a staged payments or installment payments, and later payments are reduced or stopped if the drug doesn't work, all the way through to just renegotiation of the price. But effectively, it ties the price that a government will pay for these products to how well they perform in practicality in the clinic. And the key enabler here is that you need to be able to actually track these outcomes. You need to be able to follow patients or understand if they've received this therapy in 1 year, in 6 months, in 1 year, how are they doing? What are their outcomes? Are they responding to the treatment? How is it progressing versus how we would have expected to go? So a key area is actually being able to record these outcomes. And unfortunately, in Ireland, and because sort of the health system is not fully digitized, it is actually very difficult to sort of track and record these sort of patient outcomes. So one of the sort of key aspects of this report we'll talks about is how you actually can do that. And so that kind of takes us to sort of some of the recommendations that we have in the report. So again, we've tried to address several of these areas. These all don't need to be solved in sequence and can actually, progress pretty much in parallel. So the first point is that, taking the sort of the assessment and the contracting process, the really sort of needs to be sort of a therapy assessment framework and then an adoption policy. And we feel here that dialogue is the best way to do that. So it could be guided by a white paper of the Department of Health, which sort of draws together the proposals for tackling this across the assessment process, how you give access, and how you pay for it, and what is the sort of the reimbursement discussions. Another part that is absolutely integral to that is to really embrace these types of new recruitment, new contracting models, so novel reimbursement. So here it's again to ensure the broadest possible access in a timely manner while delivering value for money for Irish patients. So it is have a risk-sharing approach, embrace these types of novel contracting. They are used in other European markets. They have been quite successful. The third, and probably one of the most urgent, most important ones, is start to think about the infrastructure to collect the data to allow you to sort of build on the assessments on these models. And in the short term, what that really means is it's about identifying, investing in, and ensuring that patient registries are sustainable. We won't have a sort of centralized top-down model or top-down approach for collecting patient data. So in the short term, we really need to rely on patient registries, tracking patients in this sort of situation. So here it is, in the 4 examples that we reference in the report, there are patient registries in place. And it's about thinking about that. It's about making sure that they're sustainable, that they're fit for purpose for tackling these types of outcomes. And this is sort of one of the key ones, and probably one of the most urgent ones that needs to start now to allow you to do the other things in parallel. And finally, around expertise and resources. So in general, the health system is well set up to sort of deliver these therapies. For CAR-T, we have 2 centers of excellence, and for the gene therapies, for the physicians that we talk to, all are confident that we're able to deliver them. So we need to ensure that we continue to invest in this to make sure that they're available, and that sort of clinicians and patients are available to do that. So there, sort of in summary, are some of the sort of the main sort of recommendations that we have around: have a framework, embrace novel reimbursement, collect the data and invest in collecting the data quickly, and continue to sort of look at sort of the expertise and resources. And then just finally, I'd just like to sort of thank the sort of supporting organizations as part of this work, which will include IFA, Astellas, Pfizer, Bayer, Gilead, Novartis, Takeda, and Janssen. So thank you very much for thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Shane. I know Shane went through a lot of the highlights there quite quickly, but I do encourage that you read the report. It's very thorough, and it gives some great illustrations of the sort of use cases for this sort of technology and these sort of medicines. So we're going to bring in our panel now, Professor David Keegan is a consultant ophthalmologist at the Matter, Brian O'Mahony is Chief Executive of the Irish Hemophilia Society, and Dr. Bernadette Carr is Executive Medical Director at VHI Insurance. You're all very welcome, and thank you for your participation this afternoon. Shane, do we have a broad idea of how much demand there is for patients right now for these sort of therapies? In your work, speaking to these stakeholders, is there a clear idea of how many patients would access and want to access these therapies right now?
So yeah, in the report we sort of list some of the sort of key areas. So certainly for approved ones where there are patients. So again, it would depend on the individual area. It could be like in under 10 for some treatments, all the way up to potentially to hundreds in some of the sort of counts, hundreds to thousands. So again, you'd probably be talking about low thousands overall if you look across the full spectrum of sort of approved diseases or approved indications for those products. So there, it's not a small number for sure. Yeah.
And in the treatment abroad scheme that you spoke about, are many of those CGTs at the moment?
So in general, what we know about is CAR T, and it's about 50 million has been spent so far on CAR T. We don't exactly know the exact number of patients that have been that have had to travel for treatment abroad, but we do know, roughly speaking, the amount that's been spent on it. Yeah.
Okay, and just finally, before we move on, in terms of a broader view of readiness for implementing these CGT therapies, there's obviously a wide variability, presumably depending on the therapy and the disease.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I can't probably speak for every disease or every therapy, but I think in general, when we've talked to people, and when we've looked at what's there, certainly if you take CAR T, there are 2 qualified centers that are able to deliver that, and also on several of the gene therapies, the physicians that we've talked to have either started to deliver these as part of clinical trials, or are comfortable that we have the sort of facilities in place. Right. Now, there are questions as to whether it's quite Dublin centric at the moment about whether that's the best approach or not. And also questions about sort of overall how familiar people are with these type of therapies and physicians as well. But in general, I would say if you were to say to start, next week, you would be confident that we'd be able to start to roll these out for sure.
David, maybe we might come to you as a clinician. Maybe you might give us your thoughts on the report and what you see as the implementation of CGTs. What are the barriers, and when you hoping to start being able to provide that service for your patients?
Great. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you, Shane, for pulling the report together with your co-authors. I think it's timely. It's right that we have this discussion. We get very much engaged in this discussion. We're coming into a new era of cell and gene therapy, and you can see from one of your slides there that these are being approved around the world over the last few years, and they're not going away. It's not a case of, oh, this is some fad and there'll be something else, or we'll be back to conventional therapies. So the sooner we actually embrace this and find a realistic model under which we can incorporate them into the Irish healthcare setting, the better. And all the time we're losing ground and we're losing expertise. So the sooner we actually have it located on the island of Ireland, that we're doing it here, we're gathering our own expertise. And Shane talked there about centres of expertise to deliver these. A lot of those have grown up over the individual interests of clinicians and researchers, supportive chief executives, and that on that backdrop and framework, because we're all familiar with the other service pressures that we have to do. But it's reached that critical point where we're sort of promising our patients that we're at this breakthrough point where these are coming, and we really need the weight of the HSE and behind us to actually start supporting the therapies. I agree with Shane. I think the infrastructure there is in its embryonic form to start these treatments and to start developing the expertise. We have it there for gene therapy. We're all set to go delivering ocular gene therapy once we get the approval. And as he said, for CAR T also. And, this may be controversial to say, we can't be hypocritical in this country. We look to encourage inward investment from pharma and other industries across the world. We sell ourselves as a high-tech educated workforce at the cutting edge of science with a high degree of third level education attainment. That brings people in. We're always looking through Science Foundation Ireland and the Health Research Board to promote research in the country, which is the right thing to do. That drives clinical standards. Now we're stumbling at the next key block, is actually delivering it on the ground for patients with and ultimately we're talking about rare disease here, and to deliver it for patients with rare disease. And it just seems like a potential another kick in the guts for those patients who feel discriminated, let down, left behind, that this therapy is there. They read about it in the UK, in Germany, in the US. Look, let's just get on and do it. The conventional payment models don't really apply. I know that when we're going through this process at the moment around ocular gene therapy. So we're talking about something that potentially will last 30 years, but we've only got hard data really for 4 to 5 years, and we're relying on extrapolating in animal models. But I think that the comfort for the government and the HSE and the payers, I see Bernadette on the call, but the comfort there is we're talking low numbers to start with. In our own case, we'd be talking 4 to 8 patients, but behind that, there are a lot of others. So look, it's exciting. We really want to grasp it. Irish clinicians and researchers want to be delivering this. And in my own field, one of the key breakthroughs in ocular genetics was by Pete Humphreys and Jane Farrar and Trinity in 1989 about the rhodopsin gene discovery. And that has spawned a whole lot of extra discoveries. So for us to be slipping behind in that regard just doesn't feel right. We want to deliver this.
I presume in your condition, the assessment is much easier because it's fairly straightforward. Would that be fair in terms of getting the data, assessing the the efficacy of the CGT, or I suppose in your case would be a gene therapy, is perhaps a lot more cleaner than in other conditions where there's other factors at play? Would that be fair to say?
It would be fair to say. It's not easy, but we've got a lot of structures in place, and we can do it by visual function, where we just check somebody's vision, or we do objective tests like visual fields or electrodiagnostics. We check the electrical activity of the retina. So we've got all of those. We've got very elegant instruments now for assessing retinal structure. And actually, we've just developed a new piece of kit with Brian Vonson in UCD, which is looking at individual photoreceptors now. So that's very powerful. So we can show the preservation of photoreceptors for gene therapy and restoration of photoreceptors when we get to cell therapies. And we're also quite active with European reference networks in bringing in patient-reported outcome measures. I feel they're very important in all of this. So we can do function, structure, and patient-reported outcome measures, and we can deliver it. So we are lucky in that regard, and we can track that over time. And we're getting better natural history data. I would have to really promote the Fighting Blindness sponsored study Target 5000, which is now in operation about 8 years. It's now one of the largest natural history studies in inherited retinal degenerations on the planet. So that was really as a way to get ourselves ready. And Shane's talking about registers. So we have these things, and we're informing other parts of ophthalmology. And I think from talking to my colleagues, other specialties. So we're ready for these.
Yeah. Brian, speaking to you earlier, when it comes to hemophilia, there's definitely a level of readiness. You feel the first Irish patient received one of these CGT therapies in a trial, and the potential for patient impact is quite large, right? Would you give us the viewpoint from you from the Irish Hemophilia?
Yes, as you say, we've had 3 Irish patients that received gene therapy about a year ago in clinical trial. That's going extremely well. Hemophilia is an ideal candidate for gene therapy. It's a single gene defect. And as was mentioned earlier, in severe hemophilia, your clotting factor level is less than 1%. Now, you don't need to make it 100% to really impact quality of life. So if you make it 10, 20, 30, 40%, you're really improving the person's quality of life, and you're protecting them against bleeding, both spontaneous and traumatic. So I think gene therapy with hemophilia is definitely very exciting. There are a lot of clinical trials in phase 2 and phase 3. We anticipate the first licensed gene therapies being licensed probably late next year. And as you said, the organization and the infrastructure part is already in place for hemophilia, because we have a national center. All the patients are on a national registry. We have national treatment protocols. We have national procurement, and that body's been working since 2004. We also have an electronic health record, a national electronic health record system for hemophilia for the last 15 years. And all of the treatment used by patients at home is reported on an app. So we've already got all the infrastructure in place to monitor this. And I think we've also done a very significant amount of detailed work on looking at how gene therapy for hemophilia could be implemented in Ireland. We'll be discussing that with the HC and Department of Health. But I think in terms of outcomes, I certainly think that, look, the big concern about gene therapy is that even if it's very exciting, as a one-off cost, it could be very expensive and might have a huge budget impact. So I think everybody has realized that there have to be innovative payment models, and they have to be based on perhaps an annual payment model with defined agreed outcomes. And the outcomes have to be practical, they have to be easily measured, they have to be readily agreed, and they have to be easily adjudicated. And we have such outcomes in hemophilia.
Yeah, in terms of outcome-based payments, like that model, there are models out there, aren't there?
There are many different models out there. There's a recent gene therapy publication in hemophilia that actually is coming out soon. Looks at 14 different potential models. So there are all sorts of innovative payment models you can look at. But I think what a payer would want, what a healthcare system would want, is in an area of uncertainty like gene therapy, because you're not quite sure will it work for everybody and how long it will last. So in hemophilia, key elements are the factor expression you achieve, what proportion of people will achieve that, and how long will it last. And you certainly don't want to pay a large one-off payment for a therapy which may not last for very long. In hemophilia, it certainly looks like it will last for at least 5 years, probably 10 years, maybe more for some types of hemophilia. So I think an annual payment model could build in some of those uncertainties into it and have an element of risk sharing between the payers and between the payers and industry in terms of taking away some of that uncertainty. So effectively, you could look at an annual payment model where you pick defined outcomes, and if those outcomes are achieved, then you pay the full price. And if those outcomes not achieved, you pay a proportionate price or no price if there's no outcome achieved.
Yeah, speaking about reimbursement, Bernadette, what is your reaction to the report, and what do you see is needed to sort of bring these therapies to patients in Ireland?
I mean, overall, Jonathan, my reaction to the report is I think this is, it's a fantastic to have a report like this, because I mean, I think there's general recognition that these treatments and all the potentially extra treatments that will come along under cell and gene therapy are huge innovations in the treatment, in particular of rare diseases. And I think that goes to an extremely important point. It's the level of innovation and investment that's required to bring therapies like this, so their possibilities for the treatment of patients is huge. Now, I think it goes to actually almost like which is where I'm going to answer your question on reimbursement. If we look at what was the model of, say, the pharmaceutical industry in the past, it was a model which was based on, if you can prove a drug or a treatment is safe and effective, it's pretty much going to get reimbursed. Now that worked very well, and we had all sorts of treatments for, like, starting with antibiotics and going forward, which that worked quite well. The difference here is the level of investment that's required to develop these therapies is enormous. Secondly, the number of patients who will actually use them is quite small, which does mean that the potential cost to a system is huge. Now, I think the only way, therefore, for that to actually work is we have to move away from a model where it's you've payers sitting in one box and you have the pharmaceutical industry sitting in another box, and then you've patients feeling that nobody's listening to us and we're not getting the treatments we need. It does require the kind of grouping we have here, where people are speaking to each other because much more closely, because I do think there is an issue that pharma on its own, and I think that's why this is a very important report. Pharma has to work with the wider society, like, for example, with the payers, and the payers have to be prepared to work with pharma through all the stages of the process. Because one of the things in terms of the research, and we've heard a good bit about this from Brian and from David in particular, like the research available for various therapies as to where it's at in terms of a stage of development to determine which patients and what's going to be the level of benefit for any particular patient varies considerably. Now, if you're talking about a therapy that costs from the hundreds of thousands to over millions of euros, I mean, that's such a large investment. Clearly, if you can start off and you can pick the patients very precisely who are most likely to benefit, then clearly the investment becomes, you're going to get from the payer's point of view, it means security, and from the patient's point of view in terms of outcomes is much higher. Now, clearly, to arrive at that discrimination in terms of which patients are most likely to benefit, there's again large amounts of research involved in that, which is why I think the discussion between pharma and between the payers, it has to be much more a continuum, and everybody and the payers and pharma do, I think, need to work together along that continuum, because it's not just about innovative ways of reimbursement, because clearly subsequent to the event, when someone's had the treatment, that's fine. And I think annual payments or payments where there's discounting if outcomes are not achieved, that's all fine. But clearly what's also extremely important is this bit up front, which is the patient selection bit, which is if you're looking at a population of patients who are, it's a lot of heterogeneity. So some patients will benefit and some enormously, but then some patients may not benefit at all. The better visibility we have of that, once in terms of using the therapies, the more value health society as a whole is going to get from these therapies. So I think, like, and I saw a lot of commentary in the report, which I think was a fantastic report, and I commend the group who did it, on, you know, the issues that potentially we think might be varied in terms of how health technology assessment is done. And I would have thought one of the key issues is, I mean, health technology assessments don't stay as a fixed thing. They do have to be able to adapt and move as pharmaceutical research moves. So that would be my general comment. I mean, clearly that issue, it's an inappropriate reimbursement model for something as expensive as potentially some of these therapies are, to say we'll pay once and then it doesn't matter, because I guess the problem is probably our healthcare system couldn't afford to do it. Our society couldn't afford to do that. So reimbursement models, absolutely. But I think that front end of patient selection is the other thing we should really look at.
Yeah, and I suppose there's a lot of work to going into understanding what curing someone in a single treatment, what sort of benefits that is, trade-off in terms of their quality of life, but also their value to the economy. There's a lot of things to assess when you're talking about literally turning a switch, as is the case in some of these treatments. So getting to some of your comments, you can ask questions in the Q&A section. Robert Love says, historically, there's no access to a host of new therapies in Ireland that are available to the UK and elsewhere. Has the overseas treatment program covering these special status to allow this support? I'm not sure if that's a question, Robert. I don't fully get it there. Alan says, thinking about drug reimbursements, we should never forget the whole burden of disease. And there's a comment we were kind of saying there. Alan says, in particular, the economic burden of disease must be explored fully by the state and payers. My wife has a forced retirement when my son was diagnosed with a clinically devastating, life-limiting genetic condition over 6 years ago. This equated to a loss of over 360,000 earnings for my wife and additional losses of earnings for me also. My son requires 7 nights nursing care. These are 10-hour shifts. The HSE pays a contractor for the service. The cost is around 218,000 per annum. There's no approved therapy for my son's condition, but if there was, it would make absolute sense to intervene at the right time to change the disease course and make savings. Shane, I can see you nodding away there. Yeah. That's probably one of many stories where we're talking about, you know, hundreds of thousands, sometimes a year, to treat a condition that could be treated overnight in some of these cases.
Yeah, and in the report we reference some of them, and there is evidence, say, in the report, or evidence to suggest, say, that if you look at spinal muscular atrophy, that the cumulative healthcare cost for that is between 2.5 and 4 million euro, right, within Europe, and sort of dealing with that. So there is a sort of focus on the price associated with these products and sort of cost savings and the cost associated with them, but it's not a one-way street, right? So there are, you know, especially in rare diseases, there is a very high cost associated with delivering sort of, you know, the current standard of care, be that what it is, as that commenter just very vividly pointed out there. So there, you know, it's not either or. I mean, if you can treat people and you can show over the longer term that, you know, this reduces your healthcare costs in other parts of the healthcare system, then, you know, that should be explored. And that should be explored either, you know, as part of sort of the continual evidence that's generated as part of this. So again, it's back to, it's not a one-time conversation. If you say to someone, we can save you 2 million in care over the next 5 to 6 years because they're this much, they're better, well, then you can hold people to that, and you can hold them through these sort of different types of contracting. It doesn't need to be particularly complicated.
Yeah. In terms of the infrastructure, we were talking a bit about that, and it goes into a bit of detail in the report. But one of the comments I heard when we were in a stakeholder meeting just discussing the report after you'd sort of shared it initially, Shane, one of the questions was around you know, the need to move now rather than wait for the infrastructure to be there in place, because if we wait for the perfect health system to assess the impact of these medicines, it'll be too late for so many patients. And that seems to be a general consensus, that there's enough now for us to get going. But is the payer kind of looking at these embryonic studies, small patient studies, amazing success at sometimes, but not a huge amount of longitudinal data? Are they looking at that and saying we need to wait, or what's your feel on that?
So in Europe, they're not waiting. So there are two parts. So first of all, they have agreed pricing for in several of these, for several of these therapies across Europe. And the second part that I would say there is in the example, say particularly in France. So after they approved one of the CAR Ts for, they found that it had a significant impact in terms of in the clinic. They actually, allowed that to be, hospitals to sort of apply for sort of funding to deliver that before the sort of contract was negotiated. So, and in Germany, they have a similar model where you can put it on the market for a year before the price negotiation needs to complete. So in several of these markets, they're moving forward to get these treatments to patients in their country at this time while the negotiations are going on, mainly because they do feel that these have an impact. So, people, I think the sort of dynamics are the same wherever you go in Europe in terms of people don't want to waste money, or payers don't want to waste money. They are nervous. They are taking chances in terms of the types of contracting that's in place, and they are moving a bit faster to sort of get those into patients in the meantime while those contract negotiations take place. So you do see a lot of you do see some movement in sort of areas where there is a sort of, be it, based on the evidence that we have, a sort of clear need or a clear impact has been shown.
David, in terms of go on, jump in, Brian. Yeah.
Bernadette talked about defining the number of people who are eligible, and I think we've taken the approach with hemophilia of trying to put the infrastructure and hopefully the systems in place before the therapies are actually licensed, probably in about 18 months to 2 years' time. And your report states, for example, there are about 800 people with hemophilia. In fact, there are about 850. Of those, about 260 are severe, but of those, probably only 80 to 120 would be eligible for gene therapy. And of those, you then have to look at the uptake, which would probably be no more than 10 to 20 people, 10, 15 people per year. So even though the numbers can look large, but then when you drill down to the number of eligible who will uptake this every year, then the numbers get more manageable. And also in terms of not just future savings, but in a therapy like hemophilia, where there are established treatments, you actually look at definite cost offsets. So the gene therapy wouldn't be a new expenditure, it would be replacing current expenditure to a large extent. So it's a different situation as well, where there are current treatment availabilities.
Yeah, that's a good point. David, in terms of patient selection, is that easy for you? Is it very obvious which patients would be good candidates for these sort of treatments?
Well, no, not initially. I totally agree with Brian. I fully endorse that approach. We've taken that approach as ahead of time. And just to put the timelines in perspective, the one gene therapy that is approved in ophthalmology for the Luxturna for biallelic RPE65 disease, the first mouse studies were reported at a big meeting in 1998. I remember it was the first one I went to as a PhD student. The dog studies reported in 2001, the phase 1 human study in 2007, and then it's another 10 years before the FDA approval. So just to give an idea, so we've line of sight on a lot of these treatments from a long way out. So that's what allowed Brian and his team and ourselves to, we're set up ready to go because we see these coming. Now we have another 8 in the pipeline in behind this, behind Luxturna, that we will hope will get approved in the coming years. But patient selection, we're back, somebody made a point about genotyping. So for a lot of the conditions we're talking about, they're genetic-based diseases, they're rare disease and they're genetic-based. We have a real dearth of availability for genetic testing, genetic counselors and clinical geneticists. So we've had to put that infrastructure, largely funded by Fighting Blindness, and more recently it's been taken on by the HSC, supporting Crumlin with the unit in the matter, and with the team in the matter, to have a clinical genetics team. So now we can accurately genotype along with the phenotyping. That's critical. So front up, no, we can't accurately identify the patients. Historically, we can now because we combine their phenotype with the genotype. But again, I endorse what Brian has said, that you'll see hundreds and hundreds of patients, but when you start going down to gene-specific therapies, that precision medicine, the numbers come down. So we estimate for the biallelic RPE65 disease, in total in this country, we think we have 8 patients. So we've got 5 under my care at the moment. We probably think there's 3 or 4 others out there somewhere, and we can start offering treatment. Not all of them will want it. Well, one gentleman who I know has sort of said, I've got this far, I'm fine. But we're worried then about the next conditions are more numerous, but we're ready to go. So we're getting a lot better at it, and we've got the infrastructure.
Darcy has a question that maybe Brian and Bernadette might come in on. He says that when you talk about patient selection, how important is it to consult with patient groups and community representatives to ensure access is as inclusive as the data allow versus just payer industry discussion? Brian?
I think it's absolutely vital. And I think gene therapy is a complex therapy. It's also an irreversible therapy, a one-off life-changing therapy. And it's something you have to go into with full, detailed and multi-stage informed consent. And the patient organizations have a strong role to play in making sure that the information is given to patients in a manner that's not just comprehensive, but comprehensible. So, for example, we produce information, booklets, webinars, meetings, workshops at different levels for different levels of comprehension. Because people will understand gene therapy in different ways. So we absolutely want to make sure with a therapy like gene therapy that there's never a chance of what we call buyer's remorse, that somebody comes back and says, I wish I hadn't taken that option. Because effectively, certainly with hemophilia gene therapy, you get one shot at this and that's it.
Bernadette?
I mean, absolutely, because I think that's the other transformative thing that has occurred in association with the use of these therapies. So there's been all the innovation in pharmaceuticals. There's the discussions around health technology assessment and all the rest of it. But clearly, the involvement of the patient, the information that's now available to the patient, the strength of the voice of the patient is the other huge factor in these kind of discussions. And it's absolutely essential they're involved in these discussions as well. And I do think it goes back to that point I was trying to make earlier, that we're not all sitting in isolated boxes, you know, basically sort of throwing sort of brickbats or whatever at each other. It is about all coming together to try and solve this problem, because I think, you know, if ultimately when we start off here, we've got patients who they have conditions that, and these treatments can be hugely beneficial for a lot of people. But the question is, how do we as a society or as a payer or whatever manage this system so we can have a sustainable system? So it's not just today's patients can benefit, but the patients in the future can benefit as well. So we can all work towards that goal.
In terms of you know, private insurers getting involved in this, what there've been one or two questions about that. I presume this is mostly looking at a different model, whereas the private will probably get involved in hospital stays and support and so on, but rather than funding the actual therapies themselves.
Yeah, it mostly goes to, like, you're right, absolutely, Jonathan. It's like, it depends on really, that's almost like a healthcare system question. What's the balance in any system between private funding and public funding? So, for example, the United States, there's much more private funding. In most European countries, and certainly in Ireland, it's predominantly a public funding issue. So it's kind of like more a societal issue as opposed to a private payer issue. But I do think the role potentially for the private payer here is because we've developed relatively, you know, we've been quite innovative in terms of our own reimbursement system. So being able to contribute from the point of view of how those systems might get designed, I think is one of the ways that private payers can get involved.
Yeah. I'm conscious of time, and I want to get next steps from everyone if I can. So just with an eye on the clock, Shane, obviously this report is great, but the aim is, I suppose, that the next step, as you feel, is at least a white paper to kind of move things on. Can you talk to us about what you think the next steps need to be to progress the path to CGTs?
Yeah, so I think that there are two parts. So one is about fixing or improving the sort of the current process or whatever is in the sort of pipeline, you know, in the assessment pipeline. The second part is kind of just, you know, in parallel, making sure that we have everything set up to kind of roll these out. So the first part, it is, you know, this does need to be sort of collaborative endeavor. We do say it's glad to hear people talk about, you know, the patient voice, because we do recommend that they're included in the sort of the process for creating this white paper to kind of finalize and give transparency on a process, but not to just stop and wait there. There are other things that can be done in terms of making sure that we're ready to sort of roll these out, and then also to start look to other countries in terms of, you know, what can be done in intermediate steps between finalizing a new process or a white paper and actually you know, between now and then, in terms of how can we sort of, you know, are there other options that we can take that we've seen in other markets? So it's not to just stop and focus on the white paper, it's continue to work in the other areas and continue to push on all fronts to sort of to accelerate access for several of these products and medicines.
Brian?
Yeah, I agree. I think a multi-stakeholder forum, bringing together the the Department of Health, the HSE, industry, clinicians, and the patient organizations with expertise in this area to come together to look at the various elements, how these should be assessed, what about access, what about, and obviously looking in detail at all the models. This may require, for example, setting up of some special purpose vehicles, because you are going beyond the concept of a one-off payment. And I don't think there's no mechanism at the moment within the Irish healthcare system to pay on an annual basis for a one-off treatment. So I think all of that needs to be explored. But ideally, the work needs to start now, so that there's a degree of work done before all of these are fully available and then hopefully accessible to people.
David, from your perspective?
Yeah, I'd really concur what Shane and Brian have said, and Bernadette's points. This can't start fast enough. These treatments are here. You know, Luxturna, for example, has been given in other countries all over the world. We've got patients here. They say, why can't they have access? So there's a little bit of, you know, why we're starting the conversation now. But there's a lot of expertise on the ground. We're ready to go. Let's get those centres up and running. Let's start to deliver them and evolve that payer model. We're not talking about huge numbers of patients. Go back to Bernadette's point, so we evolve this over the next couple of years, that it's fit for purpose for the Irish market. We all understand we have a duty of care to the Irish taxpayer as well. I mean, it's all coming from a limited pot, and nobody's saying it's limitless, but it should be fair, and that it's not discriminatory against those who previously had no access to therapy. Now they do. Let's start treating them and realize that more patients are going to come along. So a multi-stakeholder group with a white paper is great. I would fully endorse that, but let's support the rollout of this. Some of this is ready to go. I mean, Brian's expecting approvals for hemophilia treatment in the next few months. Let's get going.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Bernadette.
I mean, look, I can absolutely just agree with what people have said. I mean, this is hugely exciting. I think, okay, maybe people would say we should have started earlier, but you have to start somewhere. And I think this is a great place to start. That's all I can say.
Well, thanks very much to all of our panel, Bernadette, Shane, Brian, and David. Really appreciate your insights and all of your questions. Thank you very much for watching another of the forum. We have a fantastic piece for you next month, 24th of June at 12 p.m. We're going to be having an in-depth discussion with Mark Little, CEO and co-founder of Kinsen. He's going to be talking about the intersection of technology and medicine's innovation and the rise of the infodemic. You'll see advertisements for that, and wherever you heard about this, you'll hear about how to join that next episode of the forum. But for now, thanks again to all of our panel, to all of those who commissioned the report, and to PwC. Thanks very much for your time. We'll hopefully see you on June 24th. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Jonathan.